Afternoon. We're going to get started here in just a minute. I would appreciate if someone could let me know in the chat that you can hear me and that you can see my slides. Really appreciate that. Yes to both. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay. My name is Jennifer Houtz. I'm one of the counselors with the Ascension Employee Assistance Program. And today I've been invited to talk to you a little bit about some heavy topics, but I think very relevant ones, and hopefully with some tools and some message of hope to go along with those. I am recording this conversation. If you have something that you would like to reach out to us in a private way, you can certainly do that. And I do welcome your questions and comments in the chat, but I did want to make it known to you that we are recording. If you weren't aware, this is actually coming into the time of mental health awareness and also suicide awareness. So I'm pleased to be able to present on these topics today. I always want to be careful and respectful to realize that we have all had different experiences to suicide. Almost no one has not been touched in some way by suicide or significant mental illness and struggles. So I just want to put out there, this is a heavy topic, and to take care of yourself. And if this is something that you can't hear right now, to feel free to leave the training, but please consider to reach out to EAP. We would love to have a conversation with you. When we talk about depression and suicide, I think a lot of times we kind of clam up or freeze up. It's not an easy topic, and people often say, I have no idea what I would say. I don't know what to do. I mean, it's so awkward. And if somebody actually was talking about ending their life, oh my goodness, like what am I supposed to do? And how do I know if people aren't just joking, and would they really tell me anyway? So we're going to talk about some of those situations today, and just to acknowledge that this is a very difficult topic, but there are approaches that you can take that are very effective, and why it's so important that we're listening to each other. As I mentioned, this is a presentation offered by the Employee Assistance Program. The Employee Assistance Program is a benefit to you as an employee, for you and every member of your household to receive free counseling services. It's also an opportunity that we can come into your work groups, to your teams, or to counsel you as a manager or as an employee around work-related things. So things like this presentation could also be adapted specifically to your department, or maybe another topic that you might be interested in. Today, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the prevalence of depression and suicide, and some ways that we might identify people who might be at risk, and more importantly, what do we do if we think they are at risk, and how would we manage our own reactions around that? And finally, how are we creating, hopefully, a supportive mental health work culture? Mental illness affects millions of Americans each year. Statistically, we're talking about 1 in 5. And when we talk about children, it's more like 1 in 4 persons that are meeting diagnostic criteria for a mental illness at any point. So that doesn't mean that it's chronic or that they're always meeting those criteria, but that at some point in their life that they would meet it. Now, understanding that that means that someone's actually come to a doctor's office or a counselor's office and identified, and then been able to record in statistics. So we imagine that it's probably closer to 2 or 3 out of 5 that have experienced mental health struggles that maybe they're just not showing up in doctor's offices or counselor's office where they could be counted. To clarify, when we're talking about a mental illness, we're talking about a disorder that is affecting the brain, but very much is affecting the whole body. Sometimes we get into these specialty sort of things where, oh, well, we're talking about, mental illness, then that isn't about physical illness. But obviously we're physical, spiritual beings. It is all connected, and very much the things that we're experiencing from a physical aspect are affecting our mental health and vice versa. Perfect example is one of the biggest reasons mental health is coming into our primary care offices is people saying things like, I can't sleep, I'm having headaches all the time, I have stomach aches, or I'm in the bathroom all the time, I have back and neck pain that will just not go away, I'm having fatigue, like it doesn't matter how much I rest, I don't have energy, I just can't go, I can't focus. These are all symptoms often of depression and anxiety that manifest themselves in physical symptoms, but are very much about a mental health struggle. What we do know is that mental illness affects all areas of our functioning. So we can't say that it is only about mental health. It is about our whole health, and it affects our jobs. Obviously, it affects our relationships. It affects our interactions in the community. Very much can disrupt just our daily functioning and, of course, our enjoyment of our life. One of the awesome things that has come about with more modern technology is the ability for us to actually see mental disorders in the brain, in using PET scans or CAT scans in ways that we didn't have historically, to validate for people that there are actually structural changes and definitely functional changes that are happening to the brain when we're experiencing, for example, in this brain, depression. We also would see very different patterns between a person who has a normal functioning brain and someone who is experiencing trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. And while these things have always existed, I think it's just very validating for people who have had a diagnosis and they have done all the right things in trying to help it, but they still don't feel well. And sometimes we get that mentality of, oh, come on, everybody has tough stuff. Just like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Come on, you can do this. And for someone who has a good work ethic and has tried to push through it and is trying to do the best that they can and do all the right things, but still is not feeling well, this can be extremely validating that this is a real condition, and it's not anything that you did because you made poor choices or you have a poor personality profile or something like that. There's always questions about where does mental illness come from? And it is a multifaceted thing for sure. Some of the things that we know is that it can be genetically related. So meaning if you have a parent or a sibling who has depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or an addiction to a chemical, that your propensity to have that is higher. It doesn't mean that absolutely you will. And vice versa. You may have a family where, as far as you know, there isn't any cases of depression, and yet you are experiencing it. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio in genetics. It encounters what we call epigenetics, which I think is a really cool way to think about, for example, why our DNA doesn't always express the same. You could take two identical twins who have exactly the same DNA. One could present as having symptoms of mental illness or maybe having lots of thoughts about suicide, the other one not at all. So in that way, it doesn't follow the genetic prescription in any way that we can understand. But when we bring into account epigenetics, which means that the DNA is there, but the markers that turn on or off different aspects of DNA, and also trauma environmental stresses, and other life experiences that can be unique to that individual that interact with their genetics can make it more likely that these things could occur. We also know that people who have experienced significant trauma are more likely to develop mental illness. That being said, there are persons that experience great trauma and they don't. There are people who have been exposed to toxins or poisons or have significant nutritional deficiencies that sometimes then can present as mental health disorders. We know that other physical illness can very much affect our mental health, whether that's because of the illness or because of experience of it. So for example, a person who's going through cancer and through chemo treatment could be related to the chemicals of the treatment, absolutely. But it also can be the trauma of experiencing cancer and just the impact that that has on an individual's life and on their outlook. And we also know that lifestyle factors can make a difference too. Generally, if you're taking care of yourself, you're getting sleep, you have access to a safe living place, you have access to healthcare, you have supportive people in your life, you're more likely to be mentally healthy. But again, those aren't, 100% ironclad guarantees. Some of the symptoms of depression, I like to clarify. We've come a long way in reducing stigma, I think, by letting people know a lot more about mental health. It's become much more commonplace that we will see ads, either pop-ups or during TV commercials about mental health disorders and about mental health medications, which is great. I hope this is causing more people to ask more questions of their doctor and to talk about this more freely. But it's also caused us to sometimes have more loose language about it. So sometimes we'll hear people say things like, oh my God, I'm so depressed, where what they really mean is, I'm really bummed out, or I'm really disappointed about this one thing. Just want to distinguish that clinical depression is a different thing. It is inherent that there would be a longer period of symptoms, more than just 1 day or even 2 days. It's generally a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks that we're looking at, where a person is significantly changed in their feelings. Often it's more about feeling nothingness or emptiness, really, than it is sadness, although sometimes sadness and crying is one of those. Often it can be huge feelings of guilt or just overly responsible, yet not knowing what to do, that sort of helpless, I'm stuck sort of idea. Definitely negativity, more than just, seeing the glass half empty. It's really seeing empty. Like I just don't even know any options. Often with depression, we become very, very narrow in our field of vision, and we really can only see our aspect, and it's generally a very negative one. Sometimes we are experiencing loss of interest in things that we used to really enjoy. So we know that we like this, and in the past, this has been something that was really fun and we had a lot of energy for, and now we just don't. We just don't feel like we can even follow through on some of the things, or it just seems too great to actually go out and be social or to physically go and start a project of some sort. Often it includes changes in our appetite and eating. For some people, completely kills their appetite. And in fact, they can get to a point of almost feeling like they're gagging or like they can't eat, or that they're going to throw up if they try to eat. Other times people are very much self-medicating with food and eating a lot more than they usually would. It can also be then, along with digestive problems, as I mentioned, heartburn or just stomach pains or diarrhea situations. And then finally, one of the symptoms can be that we're having thoughts about death or suicide. So sometimes it's going back to that feeling of stuckness and, you know, if I died now, it would be okay. I just don't really see any point where things are going to get better. Or there might actually be a specific suicide plan of I'm actually thinking about a time and a place and a means. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we might distinguish those two. So we do know that there is a link between depression and suicide. Again, not a one-to-one, but we know that the majority of people who have attempted or completed suicide met criteria for major depression at the time that the suicide attempt occurred. The risk of people who are going to attempt suicide is far greater among the population of people who are experiencing depression, particularly if it's untreated, if they're not working on it through counseling or medication. Also, if they've had multiple episodes. So if this has been an ongoing or an off and ongoing situation in their life, or if they have attempted previously, much more likely that they might consider attempting again. And the introduction of alcohol or other drugs into the situation, because anytime that we're having those type of chemicals on board, we're reducing inhibitions, we're increasing the likelihood that we might do something more impulsive. And obviously, we're usually not making the best, clearest decisions and thinking about consequences. So whenever we bring drugs and alcohol into the mix, the likelihood of suicide increases. I wanted to just again, mention that when we're talking about depression, we're talking about how it can affect the entire person. And this is why we might see it coming out in, for example, someone's work performance, where they're forgetting things, where they're very negative, where they're not able to follow through on tasks, where they can't keep themselves organized, where they're having huge emotional reactions to things that they used to not, or maybe they're not reacting at all. They seem to be sort of robotic or zombie-like and not really the person that we used to know, a more restricted reaction in any kind of emotions. Definitely can influence our relationships and how we participate in them, our spirituality and our faith practices, our finances and how we're making decisions about our money. All of these things definitely come into play, not only for the individual that is experiencing mental illness, but the people around them as well. If you have been a caregiver, or you know someone who's been a caregiver to someone who's struggling with mental illness, it is very, very taxing on that person. So sometimes we're supporting someone through it, even though it's not us. We too are experiencing a secondary trauma, and we also can have a difficult time focusing. We can have a hard time paying attention at work. We can be dropping balls on responsibilities that we have in our home or in our work because we're preoccupied with this person. And obviously it affects our relationships very much. There are a lot of families who get burned out on doing everything they can to try to help someone who's struggling and maybe not being successful, or needing to do it repeatedly, that wears on us physically, emotionally, and financially. It can be exhausting. And so just to acknowledge that it might have an impact on us in a different way than being directly affected. So obviously, my bent is to encourage that people would be reaching out for help if they're struggling with some mental health concerns, and hopefully sooner rather than later. One of the great options about the Employee Assistance Program is that it's not going to cost you any money to talk to a counselor, and maybe it's just stress at this point, or it's just some bad habits that you've gotten into that we can talk about, and we can try to stave off some other things that are going on. Or maybe we can identify early on some things that are going on with your child or going on in your relationship that we can try to get ahead of that. One option is to call EAP and just even to seek out resources. Even if you know that perhaps you need to see a medical provider or a specialist, it can be so overwhelming to even know where to start, what is going to be covered by my insurance, and then what is even feasible for me to get to or my kid to get to, and then what does the wait list look like when we get there, and when do they have appointments, and there's just so many pieces. So we often are helping people navigate to figure out where those resources are. And unfortunately, now we have huge wait times for people to get into behavioral health, outpatient clinics, into psychiatry. There's just a shortage of mental health providers. So we're hearing 4 to 6 months for first appointments for a lot of clinics and outpatient services. So EAP can be a bridge to that as well. And we certainly would rather someone would call us and we can intervene sooner, even if it means that eventually they're going to be handed off to someone who's going to be a long-term provider. When we talk about suicide, sometimes I think it's helpful to actually get a visual on how many people are actually completing suicide. We hear a lot more, particularly in news and media, about homicides, which of course are awful, but you might get the perception that that's the highest cause of death, and actually self-inflicted is much higher than homicide is. The latest statistics I could find were 2019, that about 50,000 people completed suicide in the United States. Now, again, you have to recognize that this is times where they could for sure say that this was a self-inflicted death. There are many, many cases that are more ambiguous, that we aren't sure the cause of death. It could be thought that it might be self-inflicted, but we don't know, or it might be a case that's yet unsolved. I should mention too that those stats are up to 2019. Pretty much every mental health service and suicide or emergency response service that I'm familiar with has reported that during the time of COVID and past that their calls and crisis calls and either threats or completions of suicide was higher than they had ever experienced. So I'm believing that when they finally get the data wrapped up for 21, 22, that we're going to see that suicide rates have actually gone up significantly, just anecdotally from what we've seen in the mental health field. To sort of bring it home to the Wisconsin market is that we had about 887 persons that died. And again, that we know that those numbers have been going up. The highest suicide rates are generally people in midlife, and most often white men. But we know that 2 other categories are really increasing, including elderly and young adults. So unfortunately, suicide is right up there with other accidents for primary causes of death for teenagers and young adults in their 20s. So as I mentioned, anyone at any time could be at risk, but we do know that there are certain, classes of people or characteristics of people that we might want to particularly look out for. As I mentioned, if someone has attempted in the past, if they're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse disorder, particularly if it is not being treated or being managed at this point. If they've been personally affected by suicide, we know that the contagion effect is a huge issue, particularly among young people. And we know that the likelihood that someone might complete suicide if someone close to them in their family or in their friends has completed is greater. Someone who's involved in the justice or welfare system, a person who's part of our military, someone who is engaged in self-injury behavior like cutting or burning in the past, medical conditions that, for example, like a terminal illness or some sort of diagnosis that's going to be a chronic illness can be obviously very scary and make people sometimes think that this would be a better option. Any of our special groups like LGBTQ, Native Americans, as I mentioned, men in midlife and older, particularly Caucasian men, and really anybody who has experienced a lifetime trauma or is going through something that is really awful right now, where they're not able to get the resources that they need, or for whatever reason, they're not being supported. And probably the biggest one, particularly in Wisconsin and with men, is access to a firearm. So even though there are other forms and ways that people complete suicide, it's most often with a firearm for lethal means. And so we know that that is a big piece that we want to pay attention to. A lot of people that use firearms responsibly, and that's not a concern. And so we also want to respect that and respect people's privacy. But somewhere in the middle, we have to be able to assess when that is a concern and when having access to that is not going to be safe. And some of the warning signs is when people are talking about things like, I don't know if there's any hope. I don't think it's going to get any better. I don't see any way out of this. I don't think I can go on living like this. I can't do this anymore. People that are significantly withdrawing, like they just aren't participating in any social things anymore. They aren't really talking with anybody. They might not be coming out of their house. Maybe they're not coming to church anymore. They're not coming to your social group anymore. They're not coming to family events anymore. If they're talking about revenge or leaving a mark of some point, if they're talking about death in general, if they've been talking about funerals more often, if they've been talking about other suicides that they've read about, if they've just been having lots of thoughts or ponderings about what happens after we die, or how they would like to die, or what would happen if they were going to say goodbye, or things that they would want to get in order. If people are talking about things that they're going to give away, or saying things like, I just want you to know that if anything ever happened to me, you know, I care about you and I want you to have my car, or I want you to take care of my dog, or, you know, any of those sort of leading things. It's like, whoa, you know, what is going on here? We need to be paying attention. So I want to give you just a couple scenarios. Your friend Jesse is going through a really hard time, and he tells you that his mom has recently died, his uncle completed suicide, and now he admits that he's been thinking about death too. And I'm going to guess that your natural instinct, first of all, is, you know, oh my gosh, what did he just say? Did he just say that to me? Okay, what am I going to do with this? Oh, you know, it can't be that bad. And our tendency sometimes can be that we want to be happy. And I say, oh, Jesse, it's not that bad. You know, you have so much going for you, you know, you have the rest of your family and you've got good friends and you just got this promotion and you're doing great. But sometimes we skip over in really meeting people where they're at and paying attention to what he just told us. So if he's been having a lot of thoughts about death because he's had some major losses in his life, it would be better for us to slow down and to listen and to validate that, yeah, you know, when you go through losses, it's a huge blow and it doesn't get over quickly. There's a lot of struggle long after people stop talking about the loss or checking in with you or remembering anniversary dates and memorial times. So trying to be with someone where they are and not trying to quickly brush over or invalidate that they're really struggling right now. And often it's because we feel really uncomfortable when someone's in the dumps or someone's struggling. It's like, I don't know what to do and I don't really have time to deal with this. And but to just slow down and to be present with that person can be so validating. And often that's all that they're looking for is just, can someone else see me? Can someone else hear me that I'm struggling right now? Another scenario would be your friend John, who's kind of the funny guy at work, who's always joking around and making sarcastic comments. And yesterday he takes his tie and he pretends like it's a noose and he makes a funny face while he's pretending to hang himself. Or at another point, he's making a gesture like he's shooting himself or making an explosion noise or talking about, things like that. People are making jokes like that. Sometimes we have sarcasm. Sometimes we have a gallows type humor. But generally, when we hear someone saying things like that, we need to take a step back because those are not things to be joking about. And sometimes there's a grain of truth behind that. So we need to slow things down and take that person aside privately to say, okay, you've been making some jokes lately about this and I'm worried about you. What's going on with you? And or to have a teaching moment that, when you make jokes about suicide, it's not funny because almost everyone has experienced suicide. And so you're triggering other people. It's offensive to us. And it's just not appropriate for the workplace. But sometimes we need to really listen to someone and say, is there something more behind this or why are we joking about, somebody's got to talk me off the ledge or some of the comments that are used sometimes, it's really not something to be joking about. So being able to have that conversation and bring it up. And one of the myths about suicide is that if you bring it up with someone, somehow you're going to put it in their head. And that is so far from the truth. What we know is that people have thoughts about death on and off. If someone is thinking about death on a regular basis, most of the time when someone asks them specifically about it, they're actually relieved to be able to tell you that, yeah, sometimes I think about it. You for sure are not going to give them the idea that this is an option to solve your problems that they've never thought about before. There's a far greater risk of you not talking about it than talking about it. It's also true that sometimes it can be very awkward and you might feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to say this. And then they're going to be like, why are you freaking out? I was just joking. I didn't mean that. Oh my gosh. Again, better that you would take the risk of taking it seriously than not. Sometimes going around it a little more subtly to say, okay, so you've been making jokes a lot about, talking you off the ledge, it's all over, gestures. Can you tell me a little bit more about what's going on with this? Or, okay, so I'm hearing you say that, you're really feeling like you don't have any options. Like you're feeling pretty stuck. What can we do about that? Or using a sometimes thing, like, sometimes when people are really in a bad spot, they think about ending their life. Is that something that you've considered? And again, that's obviously a difficult conversation, but also a very important one. And most of the time when people are considering suicide, what they really, really love to have is one tiny little nugget of hope. And if you can talk to them in a caring, compassionate way and say, you know what, I'll help you. I'll help you find some resources. I'll get you some support. It's going to get better. It's going to be okay. We want to be able to hear that. We want to hear that there's a reason and there's hope to go on. Another scenario, Carol just doesn't seem like herself lately. She's been more irritable and looks tired all the time. you overheard her saying she wishes she could fall asleep and just never wake up. Again, if you're her coworker and you've overheard this, you might be like, oh my gosh, I do not want to deal with this. I'm going to walk the other way. But it might be a place where you can say, Carol, you just don't seem like yourself lately. Is everything okay? You mentioned something about just wanting to fall asleep and not wake up. And it probably is a case where she's like, you know what? I don't want to end my life. Sometimes it just is so stressful that I wish I could sleep for years. But thank you for checking in with me. And no, I don't have any intention, and I am getting some support, and those sort of conversations can happen. One thing I can recommend is how not to ask a question is to not poo-poo it, first of all, to not belittle a person like, oh my gosh, you're not thinking about killing yourself for real, are you? Or you wouldn't do something stupid like, try to eat a gun or something, right? Or, you wouldn't like go off and kill yourself and do that to your family, right? I mean, sometimes we have that idea. Sometimes we can also get sort of preachy about, you're going to go to hell if you commit suicide, and think of how you're going to leave everybody else, and it's going to be terrible. And truly, at the point that someone is struggling, none of those things are going to be motivating. And in fact, they're going to shut down and they're not going to talk to you about it. And it's not going to encourage them to go and get help. So to be a little more sensitive, and hopefully in this presentation, I've given you some options of something that you might do a little bit differently. For example, talking to Carol and saying, you just haven't been yourself lately. And, sometimes when people are going through really hard stuff, they talk about ending your life. Have you had any thoughts like that? So you ask the question, have you had any thoughts like that? What if they say no? Well, then talk about the positives. Talk about what they're living for, what can be hopeful. Having a powerful reminder of the people that care about them and the resources that they do have, and also who would be willing to help. Maybe a different solution or a different perspective than what they have come up with so far. On the other hand, what if they say yes? And this is the reason why we don't want to ask the question, right? Because then inside we're saying, oh crap, what do I do now? If they say they have thought about it, if they say they've been thinking about ways that they could do it that would, cause the least problem for their family, or they want to not be a burden to their family anymore, things like that, you're going to need to ask a few more questions. And the big ones are, trying to determine like how soon or imminent of a risk is this? Have they thought about a weapon? Have they thought about a time or a place or a timeline? And where is their logic behind this? What are they saying? Are they truly telling themselves and you that being dead is a better option? So listening to how they're reasoning things out. It's important to be very specific about saying, are you thinking about ending your life, versus saying something like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? It's a little more vague. And for some people, they might think you mean, are you going to go blow all your money? Are you going to, go get really drunk? Are you going to cut on yourself? Which may or may not be related to wanting to end your life. You want to be very specific about, are you really talking about that you would like to die? I don't know that talking about suicide ever gets easy, but it can be easier if we treat it as something that is occurring in our communities, that from time to time, most people do have really low points where they wonder about it, or they've been personally affected by a death or someone who has died by suicide that has really shaken them up and caused them to think about it in different ways. And I think it's also important to try to reduce the stigma around it, to recognize it as something that often occurs when we are in a state of desperation, that we are experiencing mental health symptoms that help us to not think straight or to be able to solve problems or think about consequences in the same way. And also that because people have been touched by it, we need to be careful about language. You may or may not know, but there are a lot of survivors of suicide who are deeply offended by the language of saying they committed suicide, because committed carries the connotation of either A, a sin, or B, a crime. And there are a lot of persons who have experienced someone who's died to suicide and absolutely does not believe either one of those to be the case, and that it feels very impersonal and offensive in some ways. So to just be cognizant of your language, to say they died by suicide, or they completed or they attempted suicide. Definitely to offer help, even if they say no, or they don't seem to be really a risk right now. They're saying, at one point I was really thinking about it, but not now. I'm not going to do anything right now. You still want to encourage them to seek out some support. And if it's something that you could do with them, that would be even better. So you can say, hey, you know what? Have you ever talked to the EAP service? Did you know it's free? Like, here, I'll get you the 800 number and we can call together. If you're concerned that they really need it right now, like, let's get them on the phone and I'll sit with you and we're going to talk to them together. And that's certainly a way that you can utilize EAP, or a different crisis number, 911 or 988, or calling our number, that we would help you talk with a coworker or an employee, someone in your family. If you're very concerned about them, we'll help you with the steps of what do I need to do? And you can always ask, like, is there someone I can call for you? Would you like me to call your family member? Do you need to, have the rest of the day off? Do you need to go take some time? Do you need to, call your counselor? Do you need to go see a doctor? Do you want me to call your friend? All of these things can make a significant difference in those moments when someone is really struggling. It's important that you don't promise secrecy and that you don't ever give the impression that things are a secret if someone is talking about taking their life. That if they have indicated this, that you need to follow through. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to be hospitalized. It doesn't mean that crisis necessarily needs to be called, but something has to happen to make sure that that person is going to be safe and that they're not going to be alone. So that's where, making sure that a friend is going to be there, or that their partner can come and pick them up, or that they're going to make a call to someone to be okay, and to follow up for the coming weekend or whatever, that someone's checking on them. It's also important to know that privacy laws do not count when we're talking about someone potentially hurting themselves or someone else in the community. So if you are in a work setting and you're worried if that violates a coworker's privacy or whatever, at this point, it's the Good Samaritan rule that if you really believe that they're in danger, you need to tell someone. And same if you are their supervisor. At this point, obviously you want to respect privacy and confidentiality as much as you can, but that you need to tell someone. Someone needs to know about this. And also that, to remind them that everything is confidential if they go through their doctor or through the counseling services that are available or through EAP. All of those things will be kept confidential. So also to recognize that if you have to go through something like this, or you experience this sort of situation, it can be extremely stressful. And your tendency might be to want to run away or hide or not think about it. It can make us feel panicky sometimes. It can also trigger things in us because we've had situations perhaps where we've lost a loved one to suicide. And so it's particularly scary for us. It's important that you stay as calm as you possibly can, to try to reassure others if they're freaking out, even if you aren't so sure that you're not freaking out, but to try to keep a calm head and to call those emergency numbers. And as I said, you don't have to have all the steps. You don't have to know all the answers. You just need to get them connected and they will walk you through it. And someone else then can take on the responsibility to make sure that they're okay. Miley keeps to herself a lot, but she's fairly new to the company and to the area. She's been mentioning pain in her stomach. She's seen rubbing her belly. She came to work stumbling and slurring, went to her office, closed the door, and sent an email saying goodbye. What would you do? Hopefully that we don't ever have to come into these situations, but this is probably more likely than not where it's a weird situation of ambivalence, like where we're not really sure, like, what does that mean? That are we thinking about suicide, or are you drunk, or are you saying like, goodbye, you're not going to work here anymore, you're quitting? What is going on? But being able to have that conversation of, connecting with them, seems like something's going on. How can I help you? Trying to protect that privacy, and more than anything, giving them that sense of hope. People care. People are there to support you. There is something we can do. There is a solution to what is going on. Recognizing that if you have to talk to someone about that, you're going to need to take some time to take care of you. This is very, very stressful, and being around someone who's struggling can be very, very triggering. So please take that time. Perhaps you need to call and talk to EAP because you've had a really scary experience that's happened either in the role in your work or in your personal life or community, whatever, or maybe just processing this with your supervisor or someone else that you trust, that just kind of what went on and how that affected you. And, especially if it feels like it's stuck in your head and you can't stop thinking about it, or you can't sleep because of it, making sure to take care of yourself. As an organization, hopefully we are continuing to model healthy work relationships and healthy self-care. We're trying with efforts like this for suicide and depression awareness to build a place where it's not stigmatized to talk about, it's not stigmatized to get help, to be open-minded that different people are going through different things, and something that may not seem like a big deal to you might be a really big deal to someone else, and vice versa. To be respectful in our language and to not make jokes about suicide or mental illness or crazy or things like that, that can be deeply offensive to people and also will inhibit them then from getting the help that they need or reaching out when they really need it. We know from research that just having connection with one or two people can make a significant difference. And in this age of virtual connection, we have tons and tons of friends, but we don't have many friends. So making sure that those relationships that you have, that you're nurturing them, that you actually are reaching out to them in person to connect with them, and that you let them know that you care about them and you're there for them, can make all of the difference in the world. Just being able to be acknowledged, to be seen. We know that most people are happier, that they're more resilient, that they have a greater ability to deal with stressful situations if they know that they're connected somewhere. And also just taking care of ourselves physically. So realizing that we are a holistic system. And so if we're not sleeping, if we're not exercising, if we're not eating healthfully and drinking water, if we're not making sure that we have some time away from work and that we separate ourselves from toxic situations in our relationships or whatever, it's going to wear on us. Absolutely. And it's going to increase the likelihood that we're going to struggle with mental illness, which then can increase the likelihood that we might contemplate suicide. So let's create a culture where it's okay to take some time off, and that it would be a mental health day. It could be a mental health wellness day. It doesn't have to be because we're physically sick, and that we should absolutely not apologize for using our vacation and our time away and to truly disconnect when we're not at work, because we need that for our mental health. So I encourage you to think about in your department how you might be encouraging that type of culture, and if there's something maybe you could do better. Maybe there's a role that EAP or EAP presentations could have in that, but just how do you put that out there that, you know, we all struggle with things sometimes. Let's talk about it. Let's have each other's back. We care about each other in more than just as a coworker, as a neighbor, whatever. So hopefully today I was able to update you a little bit and help you to understand how common mental health symptoms are, but that there are so many people that are living well with mental health struggles because they are managing it. They're utilizing counseling, they're utilizing supports, they're utilizing medication, they're taking care of themselves so that they're not at a higher risk for more symptoms, that there are people who are struggling, and that from time to time they might consider ending their life, that it is a bold but an enormously loving thing to be able to ask those difficult questions, and how important it can be in really making a complete difference in someone's trajectory to care about them and to put that out there. And finally, what we can do in our work environments to try to create a mentally healthy situation. And in closing, this is the contact for the Employee Assistance Program. I encourage you to go on our website, check out some of the resources that we have there. There's also links in there to our YouTube channel, and a lot of the trainings that we have done have been recorded. So in case you didn't have a chance to listen in on all of them, or maybe you'd like to watch one again or watch it with your team, these are all things that would be a possibility for you. If anybody has any questions, definitely put them into the chat. Otherwise, I thank you so much for your time, and I wish you a very mentally healthy day. Thank you.